Hi, welcome to part two. We're going to start with this one talking about what was going on with Southern attitudes toward everything that's happening. So with cotton prosperity, more and more people were brought in to the South to be enslaved. And, instead of investing in machinery or technology, they kept bringing in more and more humans. And they were complaining that the North was turning the South into a colony because the South was providing agricultural products, heavily providing agricultural products, and the North, they felt was taking advantage of that. So there were heavy fees involved with this, with farmers and plantation holders who were shipping their goods. There were about 20% in fees going along with that. So shipping fees, storage fees, insurance fees, port fees. And so this was all going to Northern merchants, and the South felt that, the North was really taking advantage of the situation. In addition, new immigrants were avoiding the South because they were coming to the United States for wage labor, and because if they went to the South, they would have been competing with people who were essentially working for free. They would not have made much money down there. So most immigrants did settle in the North, and the South was worried that eventually these people would become citizens, and then the North would have more representation and more control over government. So those were some of the things the South was getting upset with. The KansasNebraska Act took place in 1854. So you'll recall the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which said that forever, any states above this line would be forever prohibited to slavery, with the exception of Missouri. That was part of that compromise. But the Senate had wanted to make these different areas territories so that the railroad, like a transcontinental railroad, could go through, but they couldn't do that once they were officially territories. So Congress tried once to incorporate them with a ban on slavery. The South voted against it, so it did not go through. In 1854, they tried again without the ban on slavery, and instead issuing popular sovereignty in these Kansas and Nebraska territories, similar to what they had done with Utah and New Mexico. So again, this was supposed to be slavery-free, but they now are offering to make it based on popular sovereignty. And when this passed, essentially the Missouri Compromise was repealed because, this clearly went against that. And it created these territories of Kansas and Nebraska with the concept of popular sovereignty. And it passed narrowly in the House of Representatives, but it passed because people wanted that railroad, and let's face it, they were racist and they didn't care a whole lot about that ban on slavery. And so because we have now two more territories who are going to be voting on slavery, if you look at this map, you have a lot of slaveholding states here. And if you were a person in Missouri and you really wanted to extend slavery into Kansas, you might interfere with those elections, which is exactly what starts happening. We start having a race to settle Kansas, especially because of this popular sovereignty concept. And the first elections in Kansas were to be held in 1854 and 1855. So men from Missouri came across the border in large numbers, seized the polls, stuffed the ballot boxes, and really ruined this concept of popular sovereignty by illegally voting in those elections. And these fake pro-slavery numbers that were voted on allowed Kansas legislature to pass pro-slavery laws. So the people in Kansas, who, by the way, were a majority, who were against slavery, they were called free staters, and they organized their own government, drafted a constitution prohibiting slavery, and then asked to be admitted as a free state in 1855. And because that was an illegal government, in 56, several leaders from Lawrence, Kansas were indicted for treason. Now, yes, the voting was tampered with, but it was done under this guise of being official, so that didn't get called into question. The federal marshal and other volunteers from Missouri were really eager to arrest those men who were indicted for treason. So they went on this tour searching for people, trying to round those people up. The sheriff, who had been shot in Kansas, was eager to take control of this group who was searching for the treasonous men. So this sheriff took control of the group, and he and this, drunk mob of men, on their tour of Kansas, were torching buildings. They torched the Free State Hotel in Lawrence, Kansas. And in retaliation, the Free Staters, one of them, John Brown, who we'll talk about in a minute, hacked 5 of these pro-slavery men to pieces with their cutlasses. And there was just continued violence and disorder in Kansas between the Free Staters and those slave staters from Missouri. And, this is just a real clear example that popular sovereignty didn't work well, because people would just come in and tamper with those elections. So keep this in mind, that Kansas is just totally in chaos at this point. Another chaotic event is the caning of Charles Sumner. So Charles Sumner was very much anti-slavery, and while these pro-slavery attacks were going on in Kansas, Sumner gave this really passionate anti-slavery speech in Massachusetts. And a senator from South Carolina, his name was Preston Brooks, he was so upset at this insult of the institution of slavery and the insulting of Southerners that he waltzed into the Senate meeting and caned Charles Sumner over the head, so fiercely that his cane broke into 3 pieces, and Charles Sumner was bleeding, unconscious, and, the North was sort of just crazed with outrage over this whole event, that someone would actually come in and do this. The South thought that Preston Brooks was a hero, so much so that they started sending him new canes in the mail. And so this is, clearly building up to be a very chaotic moment, which does end up leading to the war. Another event that we should talk about is this Dred Scott decision. So Dred Scott was an enslaved man who lived in Missouri, and his slaveholder and himself moved to Minnesota, where slavery had been banned. They stayed there for a while. Eventually, they both moved back to Missouri. And Dred Scott, when they got back to Missouri, sued for his freedom, because when he was in Minnesota, technically he had been a free person. And he argued that that should have released him from any former bondage he was in. So this went to trial. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled against Dred Scott 7-2, saying that no, just because you move to a free state doesn't mean that you will then be free if you move back to a slave state. So when the majority opinion was written for this, it included the ruling that African Americans were not citizens and never had been. It also stated that they had, and this is a quote, no rights which the white man was bound to respect. In addition, it ruled the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional. So this was a major, major decision. Southerners were obviously stoked about it. It said the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. Does that mean that slavery can be legal everywhere? It also really, justified everything that the South was thinking and doing at this time, and essentially declared popular sovereignty unconstitutional, because, how could territory legislatures make the law, and federal government can't, was a decision saying that slavery was legal everywhere, and it was very confusing. Northerners were disheartened, Southerners were encouraged. And this is also the time when we're going to look back to Kansas again. So in 1857, delegates in Kansas write their state constitution. Now, the Free Staters are boycotting this, just letting the pro-slavery men have control of it, because President Buchanan had said that whatever constitution is written, there will be a fair vote on that document, either accepting it or rejecting it. So the Free Staters just didn't get involved. They were going to vote against it. So the Constitution was written with legal slavery, and it also said that the Constitution and slavery could not be voted on. And even though Buchanan had said that there would be a fair vote on the document, he didn't enforce that promise because he was, he was pro-slavery. And so we have this Constitution, basically in effect. Everyone freaks out, saying this is fraud, they're outraged. There was a promise that we were going to vote on this document. And because of that, the House of Representatives did end up rejecting their Constitution, gave it back to Kansas for the vote that had been promised. And the vote was heavily defeated this document, 11,300 to 1,788. And that made it clear that Kansas would be a free state. So this incident, because of the fraud and the lying and the promises that were not delivered, really drove a lot of conservatives into the Republican Party. So we do have a worried South here. I'm worried North too, of course. The South is worried about being hemmed in by Northerners and free states being snuffed out. The North is worried that these pro-slavery ideas were going to start bringing slavery everywhere, especially after that Dred Scott decision. But there are other concerns as well, especially in the South. So the cost of purchasing an enslaved human was rising, while the percentage of Southerners who owned humans was decreasing. So a gap in wealth was occurring. The Southerners thought that Kansas and California were unfairly closed off to slavery. Another issue that pops up is this Freeport Doctrine. And this is a loophole that Stephen Douglas found, which stated that if Congress can't ban slavery in a territory, the territory can effectively ban it by just refusing to enact a slave code. And this is, an advantage to free staters, saying if there's not a way for them to ban slavery, all they have to do is not enact that slave code, and there's no framework for having slavery in that territory. The South as well is facing agricultural reform. They tried to implement machinery and industry and have a more effective way of, shipping agricultural products. Didn't really work out well, and they wanted to diversify the crops. That didn't work out well. It was heavily cotton. Their dabbling in industry failed. They had some military invasions to go down in Latin America and hopefully add some slave territory. That failed. And they were just feeling very isolated from the rest of the nation, almost like another country. There was a clear divide between the North and the South at this point. Now, the last thing I want to talk about on this part of the presentation is Harpers Ferry, Virginia. And this was in 1859. So John Brown was from Kansas, and I mentioned him. He had been one of those free staters who went and attacked the pro-slavery men in Kansas. He was financed by Northern reformers, and he was joined by about 21 followers, both black and white, trying to start a slave insurrection in Virginia. So he went there, he seized the unguarded federal armory at Harpers Ferry. Again, he was hoping to spark some sort of rebellion, an insurrection, and his goal was to, in one major event, end slavery. And the problem is that not many enslaved people lived in the area where he was trying to start this, and so not many people showed up. Federal troops ended up coming down, led by Robert E. Lee. They captured Brown and everyone with him, including two of his sons. He and his sons were executed. And Brown really was made a martyr of the cause. And it strengthened some of the North's resolve. It definitely angered the South, especially when the North was sympathetic to John Brown. And Frederick Douglass, who you've read, as you know, was really a huge fan of John Brown. He said, "I could live for the slave. John Brown could die for the slave." And we'll get back here in just a minute.